And now it's time for French Connections, our weekly look at the intricacies of French life with Florence Villeminot. Hello,
Hi,
Florence. This week we're going to focus on France's 35-hour working week, the government reviewing it as part of labour reforms.
That's right. France's famous or infamous 35-hour work week. It certainly is a cause of fascination abroad. Now, it was introduced in the year 2000 by Lionel Jospin's socialist government, and it completely revolutionized working life in France. Les 35 heures the law was championed by Martine Aubry. She's a familiar face in French politics. You can see her right there. Now, she was labor minister at the time, and she argued that limiting working hours would actually encourage companies to hire more, thus creating jobs and improving the well-being of workers at the same time. Let's listen to what Martine Aubry had to say at the time.
Job creation should be the big winner. Thus, our campaign slogan, free time for you, an opportunity for job creation.
Now, Martine Aubry might look like a familiar face. She's actually currently in the spotlight these days for lashing out against President François Hollande's plan to reform the labor code. She says that it would actually weaken France.
Now, as you mentioned, when it was introduced, the government promised the 35-hour working week would create jobs. Did it?
Well, the government promised it would create between 600,000 and 800,000 jobs. And in the 10 years that followed the law, 350,000 new jobs were created. But there's a big debate over how much the 35-hour work week had to actually do with that job creation. Let's listen to one economist's point of view.
We'll never really know the truth. To put it simply, we've observed that the evolution of job creation in France was completely parallel to job creation trends in other European countries. In other words, we haven't seen any link between job creation and the 35 hours.
Now, from the very beginning, the 35-hour working week has been a very divisive issue. Tell us about the opponents, then.
Well, the right-wing and business representatives are really the fiercest critics of the 35-hour working week. They say that it's actually the root cause of all of France's economic woes. It makes France less competitive. It dissuades businesses from hiring people. It costs the state a lot of money. And now, when Nicolas Sarkozy ran for president in 2007, his campaign slogan was actually "Travailler plus pour gagner plus." Work more so you can earn more. And let's listen to what he had to say at his very first, the main press conference when he became president. He essentially vowed to do away with the 35-hour working week. Let's listen.
Do you want 2008 to mark the end of the 35-hour work week?
To be completely honest, yes.
So lots of tough talk there from Nicolas Sarkozy, but when in power, the right wing didn't actually do away with the law altogether. Instead, what they did was they tweaked the law. They kind of watered it down, made it a lot more flexible, made it easier, essentially, for businesses to get around the 35-hour working week. And what's ironic is that the current socialist government, the reforms they want to put in place, will actually go a little bit further into making the law more flexible.
So 16 years on, what's the situation today? Because really, a lot of people don't just work 35 hours a week, do they?
That's right. That stereotype of the lazy French worker really attached to their 35-hour working week is a little bit blown out of the water. First of all, the law doesn't apply to everyone here in France. Keep in mind that business owners, for instance, they are not at all concerned by the 35-hour working week. In fact, they work a lot more. But so do France's 23.8 million employees. In 2014, French employees worked on average 40.5 hours a week. Now, they get benefits in exchange for this extra time, but we'll get to that in a minute. But let's take a look at a comparison. France is 40.45. It's lower than Germany and the UK, but you can see it's higher than Denmark, where they work 38.8 hours a week. Now, what's interesting is there are some people that do work 35 hours a week here in France, and what's interesting is they tend to work in the public sector, or they tend to be paid by the hour.
Now, you mentioned that cliche of the lazy French worker, but again, it's not because you're working fewer hours that you're less productive. In fact, French workers are amongst the most productive in Europe.
That's right. If you look at labor productivity, the value of goods and services produced per hour per worker. France is pretty good, actually. It's fifth highest in the EU. You can see it here, 45.60 euros, higher than Germany, higher than the UK, and higher there than the EU average. Now, defenders of the 35-hour work week say that this is because employees' well-being was improved, and therefore they're more productive. That being said, though, you must keep in mind that unemployment is a lot higher here in France, and that skews the figures a little bit because you're dividing total productivity by a lower number of workers. So that tends to pump the figure up a little bit for France.
Right. Now, you mentioned the politics of all of this, but what does the average French person think of the 35-hour work?
Well, it's a little bit hard to gauge that because they're constantly polls and they are very confusing. Some polls say that people are totally against the 35-hour work week. Some polls say that people are really attached to it, just like the political class. French society seems to be very divided on the issue. Now, what is clear, though, is that the 35-hour work week gave French workers more free time. And that leads us to our word du jour, a word that comes up a lot in French conversations, RTT. Now that is réduction de temps de travail, quite literally, but people just refer to it as RTT. Anytime an employee works over the legal limit, they get either extra pay or they get time off. This RTT is kind of like a vacation day that you can take whenever you want. And as you can imagine, French people quite like these RTTs. Let's listen to one point of view.
When you have to work overtime, you tell yourself, it's okay, I'm going to get a day of RTT. It's a real breath of fresh air.
And that raises a really important point. Here in France, probably true in other parts of the world, but particularly here in France, workers are really attached to finding a work-life balance. And so even though most workers tend to work more than 35 hours a week, this 35-hour week law really kind of brought workers closer to that very cherished goal of finding that balance between work and free time.
I have to say that personally, that's one thing I love about France.
Exactly.
That they cherish that work-life balance, and people aren't celebrated for working a ton, but for having a good balance between the two. Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed, Flo. And if you have any questions about France that you'd like us to explore in French Connections, then do tweet Flo at Flo Vinminot. You can also check out, of course, the website.